There are moments when two seemingly distant worlds quietly meet, when the paths of logic and introspection intersect so intimately that a deeper truth begins to emerge. One such meeting happened not in a monastery or a laboratory, but in the depths of contemplation carried by two extraordinary minds. One, a scientist revered for his equations, and the other, a sage long gone whose words echoed through silence. When Albert Einstein, the face of 20th century science, looked at Buddhism, he didn't just see a spiritual tradition. He saw, astonishingly, a framework that paralleled the most groundbreaking discoveries of physics. And he didn't say it casually, he meant it. He once shared that if there was any religion capable of keeping pace with the needs of modern science, it was Buddhism. To the casual ear, that might sound like a poetic compliment. But in truth, it was the quiet recognition of a deep philosophical resonance. As Einstein peeled back the layers of time, space, and matter, he found again and again that the universe did not behave in the tidy, fixed way humans like to imagine. And as he stood on the precipice of this new understanding, he realized that what Buddhist monks had been discovering through centuries of meditation aligned astonishingly with what he was discovering through mathematics and thought experiments. This alignment wasn't accidental. Einstein's journey, like the Buddha's, began with deep questioning. As a child, he was curious to the point of discomfort. He rejected ritual early, walked away from conventional religion, and refused to accept answers simply because they were written in books. At 16, he asked a question so profound that it would change physics forever. What would it look like to ride alongside a beam of light? This wasn't a scientific problem at first. It was a child's moment of wonder. But from that question arose the theory of relativity, and that's where the parallels began to appear. Because Siddhartha Gautama, the man who became the Buddha, didn't arrive at enlightenment by accepting traditions blindly either. He rejected the luxury of his palace. He walked away from comfort, and like Einstein, he began to question everything he had been taught. Both men, separated by centuries, refused to settle for answers that didn't feel right. Both turned inward. Both sat in stillness, in contemplation, and from that stillness came revolutions. Einstein's life was filled with formulas. Yes, with chalkboards, debates, and scientific journals. But it was also filled with silence, with long walks, with moments of what he called deep thought experiments, the quiet unraveling of assumptions. He once said that he came to his greatest realizations not by doing, but by stopping, by entering a state of still wonder. That's not unlike meditation. It's not unlike what the Buddha taught. That insight comes not from endless analysis, but from clarity. And in this clarity, Einstein began to see the world not as separate parts, but as a fluid whole. Time wasn't fixed. Space wasn't absolute. Matter and energy, once thought to be distinct, were revealed to be two expressions of the same reality. Everything he discovered was connected. And with that realization, he stepped into a space that Buddhist philosophers had occupied for thousands of years. The Buddha taught that nothing exists independently, that all things arise in dependence upon conditions, that there is no solid, unchanging self, no permanent object, only processes and relationships. Einstein's equations spoke of a universe in flux, a cosmos without absolutes, where even time could stretch or compress, where space could bend and fold. In Buddhist terms, this is impermanence, anicca. It's the realization that nothing stays the same, that clinging leads to suffering, and that understanding change is the path to liberation. But Einstein didn't stop at physics. His discoveries unsettled him, not because they were wrong, but because they revealed how fragile our assumptions truly are. And when he looked out at the world, at the rise of nationalism, at the devastation of war, at the use of science to destroy rather than uplift, he began to turn inward once more. What good is knowledge, he asked, if it doesn't lead to wisdom? This is where his path began to mirror the Buddha's even more closely. For Einstein, the deeper his understanding of the cosmos became, the more he was pulled toward compassion. He saw that our sense of separateness, our illusion of being isolated egos in a cold universe, was at the root of human suffering, and he called it exactly that: an optical delusion of consciousness. Just as Buddhist teachings speak of the illusion of the self, the ego, the delusion of permanence, Einstein arrived at the same truth through science. In the wake of the Second World War, after seeing how his own discoveries had led to unimaginable destruction, he became a voice not just for knowledge, but for peace. He advocated for nuclear disarmament, for global unity, for compassion as the only viable future. He warned that the splitting of the atom had changed everything except our way of thinking, and unless that changed, we were doomed. What he longed for was a shift in consciousness, and that's exactly what the Buddha had pointed to thousands of years before. That true transformation begins not with external systems, but with inner awakening. That peace is not born through power, but through presence. That wisdom without compassion is dangerous, and compassion without wisdom is blind. And so Einstein began to speak of what he called a cosmic religion, one that didn't worship a personal God or rely on dogma, but which emerged from a reverent awe at the universe itself. A spirituality that was scientific in its honesty and human in its humility. It was, in all but name, Buddhism, not as a faith, but as a framework, as a way to see the world not through division, but through unity. There's a photograph of Einstein late in life. His hair is wild, his eyes tired, but behind them is something else, a kind of softness, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from surrender, from realizing that the more you know, the more you understand how little can be known. That the mystery of the cosmos is not a problem to be solved, but a truth to be lived. And in that mystery, he found reverence. In the laws of nature, he found holiness. In the interconnected dance of particles and galaxies, he found the same thing Buddhist monks find when they sit in silence: belonging, not as a person in a crowd, but as a pattern in a vast, intelligent, unknowable whole. This is where the scientist became the sage, where the chalkboard became the cushion, where physics met philosophy not in contradiction, but in communion, where the search for the quantum world became the same search the Buddha undertook beneath the Bodhi tree, not for a god, but for truth. The story deepens when we explore one of the most curious friendships of the early 20th century, a conversation between a German physicist and an Indian poet, held not in a temple or a university, but in the quiet comfort of Einstein's home in Kaput. That evening in 1930, two great minds from opposite ends of the earth sat face to face. One, Albert Einstein, the man who gave the world the theory of relativity; the other, Rabindranath Tagore, a mystic who won the Nobel Prize for Literature and whose heart pulsed with Eastern philosophy. They spoke of truth, not as something objective or subjective, but as something that lives in the tension between the two. Einstein asked, "Do you believe in the divine as a separate entity?" Tagore replied, "No, the divine is realized in humanity itself." Their conversation was subtle and layered, but what it revealed was profound. Two men speaking different languages of mind and spirit had both arrived at the same conclusion: that reality cannot be fully known through formulas alone or poetry alone, that the true nature of existence transcends our categories. Einstein had long sought the old one, and as he called it, the fundamental harmony of the universe, the thread running through every atom, every galaxy, every moment. It was never a personal deity to him. It was the elegance of equations, the symmetry of light, the silence between notes in a symphony. Tagore, too, spoke of the unity behind all things, not as doctrine, but as song. And their dialogue became a dance, a merging of East and West, science and spirit, intellect and insight. This moment wasn't just poetic, it was prophetic. Because in the years that followed, science would begin to reach deeper into realms that once belonged solely to philosophy. Quantum physics emerged, shattering the illusion of a clockwork universe. Suddenly, particles could be waves. Light could exist in multiple states at once. And what's more astonishing, our observation of these particles changed how they behaved. Reality was no longer fixed, it was participatory. And as the scientists dug deeper, they found themselves brushing against the same truths that Buddhist monks had long meditated on. That what we perceive isn't solid or separate, that we are not observers of the universe. We are participants in its unfolding. This is the heart of sunyata, the Buddhist concept of emptiness. Not that things don't exist, but that they don't exist independently. Everything arises in dependence on everything else. Einstein, who was once skeptical of quantum mechanics, eventually came to accept this interconnection, even though it unsettled him. He called it spooky action at a distance, this strange phenomenon where two particles could affect each other across space without any physical link. It violated classical logic, but it worked, and it mirrored the Buddhist metaphor of Indra's net, a cosmic web where every jewel reflects all others endlessly. The metaphor wasn't just spiritual poetry, it was a map of reality itself. The deeper science went, the more it confirmed what the sages had long whispered, that the self is not a separate entity, that time is not absolute, that reality bends and shifts depending on how it's seen, that our beliefs shape our perception, and our perception shapes the world. These weren't just ideas in ancient scrolls anymore. They were showing up in labs and particle accelerators in the mathematics of space-time. And still, Einstein wasn't content to stop at discovery. He wanted understanding, not just of the universe's mechanics, but of its meaning. He once said, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science." This wasn't romanticism, it was reverence for the interconnectedness of things, for the wonder that lies beneath certainty. This sense of mystery, so central to both Einstein and the Buddha, isn't confusion. It's the quiet awe that arises when you glimpse something vast and intimate at the same time. It's what happens when you watch the sun rise and realize it's both ordinary and sacred. When you read an equation and feel the presence of something beyond numbers. When you sit in silence and hear the echo of your own existence stretching out into everything. Einstein believed that this sense of the mysterious was the foundation of true spirituality. Not belief in dogma, but a direct experience of unity. He often rejected the idea of a personal God, but he never dismissed the divine. Instead, he redefined it. For him, God was not a being, but a principle. Not a judge, but a presence. Not a voice from the sky, but the order woven into the fabric of existence. And in that, he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Buddha. Not as a monk, but as a witness. As his understanding grew, so did his sense of responsibility. He began to speak more about ethics, about compassion, about the necessity of awakening, not just intellectually, but morally. He saw that the same insights that freed our minds could, if misused, destroy our world. The splitting of the atom had given humans immense power, but it hadn't taught them how to wield it wisely. That wisdom, he believed, had to come from the heart. So he urged scientists to become more than technicians. He called on thinkers to become feelers. And he warned that the next great leap in human evolution wouldn't be technological, it would be spiritual. That unless we evolve in consciousness, all our knowledge would be a weapon turned inward. These were not the words of a man in a lab coat. These were the words of someone who had touched something sacred through his inquiry and knew with all his being that understanding must lead to care. That is perhaps where Einstein and the Buddha align most closely. not in how they saw the world, but in how they responded to it. Both understood that suffering begins in illusion, in the belief that we are separate, alone, disconnected. And both saw that the path to peace, both individual and global, begins with waking up. Not just to reality, but to responsibility. That what we see, we shape. That how we live matters. Einstein once wrote, "A human being is a part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness." He went on to say that our task must be to free ourselves from this delusion by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. This is not science fiction. This is spiritual instruction, not from a monk, but from a physicist who looked so deeply into the structure of reality that he found love there. And not romantic love, but the love that comes when you realize that the suffering of others is your suffering. That peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding. That awakening is not an escape, but a return. And so the thread between Einstein and the Buddha continues to stretch across centuries, disciplines, and traditions. Not as a coincidence, but as a convergence. A reminder that truth, when sincerely sought, leads always to compassion. That the more clearly you see the universe, the more deeply you are moved to care for it. As Einstein's understanding of the universe matured, so too did his awareness of the delicate nature of humanity's future. He had watched with both pride and deep concern as the power of scientific discovery unfolded into forms of unimaginable destruction. What began as pure curiosity had given rise to consequences he had never intended. The same equation that described the unity of mass and energy, E equals mc squared, had become the foundation of nuclear weapons. And when Hiroshima and Nagasaki turned theory into tragedy, Einstein was forced to confront the weight of his own brilliance. He had touched the core of nature, only to realize that touching it without compassion was like handing fire to a child. In a letter to Indian Prime Minister Nehru, Einstein expressed sorrow, not merely about what had happened, but about what could still happen. His discoveries, meant to uplift the world through understanding, had become instruments of fear. And it was here that the arc of his life bent unmistakably toward the moral terrain that the Buddha had traversed long before. Where once his focus had been the structure of the cosmos, it now turned to the architecture of peace. He began to speak not of atoms and particles, but of interdependence, of the illusion of separateness, of the necessity for global unity. And with each new interview, each carefully chosen word, he sounded more like a spiritual teacher than a scientist. Not because he had left science behind, but because he had followed it to its deepest truth, the one that lies beyond equations and enters the realm of human responsibility. Einstein had seen that we are all entangled, not just at the quantum level, but in life. That what happens in one corner of the world affects every other. That the suffering of others is never truly separate from our own. This idea, which modern physics was only beginning to understand through quantum entanglement, was already alive in ancient Buddhist texts. The Buddha taught that everything arises in dependence on everything else, that nothing exists in isolation. And so Einstein began speaking of the need for a new kind of thinking. He said, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." What was required, he believed, was a radical shift in consciousness, a movement from division to unity, from ego to empathy, from competition to cooperation. These were not abstract ideals. They were, to him, survival strategies. He envisioned a world without borders, not one devoid of culture or identity, but one rooted in shared responsibility. He believed that nationalism was yet another version of the same optical delusion of separateness that plagued individuals. To see oneself as merely a citizen of a single country, he argued, was to miss the truth of one's place in the cosmos. Just as the Buddha had urged people to let go of clinging to identity, Einstein asked humanity to expand its vision of belonging. His calls for unity weren't met with universal praise. There were critics, of course, those who believed that scientists should stick to science, that morality and politics had no place in physics. But Einstein knew otherwise. He had seen what happened when knowledge was divorced from wisdom, when power was severed from purpose. And so, he pressed on. Not with force, but with clarity. He co-founded the Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, not to lobby for policy, but to awaken conscience. He lent his voice to global peace movements, not to gather attention, but to offer direction. And quietly, insistently, he continued to link his scientific vision with spiritual insight. He spoke of the universe not as a machine, but as a web. Not as chaos, but as order. Not as cold matter, but as living energy. And always at the heart of his message was the call to widen the circle of care. This widening, he believed, was not a luxury. It was a necessity. For in an interconnected universe, the suffering of the other is never truly other. To harm another is to harm oneself. To protect the earth is to protect the body. To fight for peace is not a cause. It is a condition for life. And so the mirror between his words and the Buddhist teachings became ever clearer. For the Buddha, the path to liberation was not found in dogma, but in direct insight into the nature of reality. It was about seeing through illusion, not just the illusion of permanence, but the illusion of separateness. Suffering, he taught, is born from craving, from the belief that we are cut off from what we desire. But when one sees that all things arise together, that there is no true boundary between self and world, suffering begins to dissolve. Einstein too began to speak of illusion, not in metaphysical terms, but in experiential ones. He said, "Reality is merely an illusion, albeit a very persistent one." He wasn't dismissing the world, but inviting us to look deeper, to question what we take for granted, to wonder whether the solidness of a rock, the passage of time, the identity we carry, are they as real as we think, or are they constructs of perception? This inquiry brought him closer to another ancient Buddhist teaching, that of Maya, the illusion that binds us to a surface understanding of life. Buddhism doesn't claim that the world doesn't exist. It simply insists that the way we usually perceive it is incomplete. And Einstein, through quantum theory and relativity, began to show how true that was. Time is not fixed. Space bends. Matter is energy. The world is not what it seems. Even his own famous equation, E equals mc squared, carried this truth, that what appears solid can dissolve into light, that form and formlessness are not opposites, but reflections, that the world in its most basic essence is fluid, dancing, dynamic, that permanence is an illusion, and in its place stands transformation. The more Einstein explored, the more he encountered mystery. But unlike many, he didn't flee from it. He moved toward it. He welcomed it. He once said, "The most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible," and in that paradox he found wonder. For him, science didn't remove mystery, it deepened it. Just as the Buddha's teachings do, not by giving final answers, but by inviting ever deeper questions. And so, science and spirituality met again. Not in contradiction, but in complement. One asked how, the other asked why. One explored the mechanism, the other the meaning. And both, at their highest levels, pointed to the same truth, that we are part of something vast, something intelligent, something sacred. not because it is supernatural, but because it is deeply natural. As he aged, Einstein stopped talking so much about equations and started talking more about experience. He began to speak of awe, of stillness, of love. He said that the intuitive mind was a sacred gift and the rational mind a faithful servant, but that our society had elevated the servant and forgotten the gift. And in that sentence lay another bridge to the Buddha. For what is meditation, if not a return to the sacred gift of intuition? What is mindfulness, if not a softening of the analytical mind so that we can hear the deeper rhythms of life? Einstein may never have sat beneath a Bodhi tree, but he sat beneath the stars. He may never have taken vows, but he lived with reverence. And in the end, his life carried a message that echoes across centuries and cultures, that the deepest truths are not separate from us. They are within us, waiting to be remembered. There comes a time in the lives of those who have journeyed far in thought when the pursuit of answers begins to soften into something quieter, something humbler. For Einstein, that transition was not dramatic but gradual, like the shift from day to dusk. In his later years, as his body aged and the noise of the world grew louder, he turned more and more inward, not to escape the world, but to better understand it, to understand himself. The man who once calculated the behavior of stars now spent long hours in silence, thinking not about galaxies, but about the human heart. He no longer sought breakthroughs to astonish the world. Instead, he reflected on the human condition, on suffering, on the frightening gap between our technological power and our spiritual maturity. It disturbed him that while humanity had discovered how to split atoms, it had not yet discovered how to live in peace, that we had measured the speed of light but failed to measure the weight of our own cruelty. And in this reflection, he grew softer. He began to write more about kindness, about the soul, about the importance of compassion. He no longer saw these as peripheral concerns. They became central. Only a life lived for others is a life worthwhile, he said. This was not the pronouncement of a saint, but the realization of a scientist who had wandered through the fabric of the universe and come back holding silence in his hands. He often spoke about the cosmic religious feeling, a term he used not to define a new religion, but to describe a way of being, a quiet reverence toward the mystery of existence, an unshakable sense that life, though fleeting and fragile, is stitched together by something profound and worthy of awe. This feeling, he believed, could not be taught through doctrine or imposed through ritual. It had to be felt. And it was in this feeling that he saw the seed of a new kind of ethics. An ethics not born of commandments, but of clarity. The clarity that arises when you understand that everything is connected. This echoes the Buddha's vision with haunting precision. The Buddhist path does not command, it invites. It does not threaten, it reveals. And at its core lies the same insight Einstein returned to again and again. Interdependence. That your breath is not separate from the air. That your life is not separate from the lives around you. That your actions ripple across space and time in ways too subtle to trace, but too powerful to ignore. In both Einstein's late writings and the Buddha's earliest teachings, there is a shared understanding that the root of suffering lies in forgetting this connection, in believing that we are separate, alone, disconnected, that the illusion of the self as an isolated unit, seeking only its own gain, is the starting point of so much destruction. Not only in relationships, but in politics, in war, in how we treat the earth. Einstein did not use the language of karma, but he understood it intuitively. He saw how actions born of ignorance or compassion create worlds. He saw how thoughts shape choices, how choices shape societies. He warned that hatred, left unchecked, becomes policy, That fear, if fed, becomes violence. That division, if normalized, becomes catastrophe. But he also saw the inverse. That kindness could heal. That one act of truth could undo decades of falsehood. That one moment of clarity could birth a generation of peace. And so in his final years, he became not just a scientist or philosopher, but a quiet advocate for awakening. He didn't ask people to believe in a higher power. He asked them to believe in their own ability to care, to look beyond the narrow frame of nationalism, race, religion, and begin to see through the eyes of the cosmos. To understand that we are all stardust, yes, but more importantly, that we are all story. That your joy and someone else's pain are not opposites, but threads in the same tapestry. That liberation is not individual, but collective. This was a radical shift, even for Einstein. He had always believed in truth, but now he saw that truth without love was incomplete, that knowledge without empathy was dangerous, and that the real measure of intelligence was not IQ, but the depth of one's compassion. In private letters, he expressed admiration for those who live simply and love deeply. He once wrote that he envied people who were not burdened by the need for recognition, but who found joy in the small details of life. A good meal, a kind gesture, a moment of stillness. This sounds strikingly like the heart of Buddhist mindfulness. Not chasing after pleasure or avoiding pain, but being fully present with what is. He began to describe life in increasingly poetic terms. He spoke of nature as sacred, of the music of Mozart and Bach as evidence of divine order, of the power of silence to reveal what words could not. His thoughts were no longer just ideas. They became prayers, not to a deity, but to existence itself. He said that the most beautiful experience was the mysterious, that whoever has not experienced it has no sense of wonder and is as good as dead. This wonder was his temple, this awe, his meditation, and in that space he walked beside sages and mystics of every tradition, even if he had never intended to. His path, carved through numbers and reason, had brought him to the same summit, and from there the view was familiar. Emptiness, fullness, oneness. The realization that in the vastness of it all, we are small not in worth, but in separation. That humility is not weakness, it is wisdom. Einstein's story reminds us that you don't have to wear robes or sit beneath a tree to awaken. You can do it while scribbling equations or fixing a pipe, while raising children or teaching a class. Awakening is not bound by role. It is bound only by your willingness to look deeply, to feel fully, to act kindly. And perhaps that's the message his life most clearly offers, that the universe is not something to conquer or control, but to be in relationship with. That to understand it is not only to learn its laws, but to live them, to embody their implications, to realize that the same energy that fuels a star pulses in your veins, that the atoms of your body once danced in the heart of ancient suns, that when you breathe, you're not just surviving, you're participating in something holy. He may not have used the word enlightenment, but what he described in his later reflections bore all its marks: clarity, compassion, interconnection, humility, and peace. He reached the edge of what science could show him and saw not a void, but a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw the world, not as parts, but as one. There's a kind of beauty that arrives only after decades of seeking, not the beauty of youth or discovery, but the beauty of surrender. Albert Einstein reached that place slowly, without fireworks, without acclaim. In his final years, he lived quietly, surrounded not by celebration, but by stillness. The accolades were behind him, the headlines faded, and what remained was something quieter and far more valuable. The simple presence of a man who had seen the edges of time and space, and had returned with the soft truth that love, not knowledge, is the foundation of peace. He had once been the symbol of human intellect, a genius whose thoughts bent the fabric of space-time. But by the end, he no longer seemed interested in being known as a genius. He had become more like a monk in a lab coat, his mind still sharp, but his focus turned inward. He would spend his days walking slowly through gardens, writing letters to friends, reflecting on the fate of the world. Visitors noted how his home in Princeton was filled not with trophies or reminders of his success, but with simple things: stacks of books, quiet music, and windows filled with natural light. He had no grand desire to be remembered. He often said that fame was a poor substitute for meaning, that what mattered wasn't recognition, but contribution, that the real legacy of a life isn't what you leave behind, but how you leave others change. And for him, that change could no longer come through equations. It had to come through empathy. This is where he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Buddha, not because they wore the same robes or spoke the same language, but because they reached the same horizon, one through meditation, the other through math. But both found the same truth at the end of their paths, that the self is an illusion, and love is the only thing that matters in the end. Einstein came to see science not as the opposite of spirituality, but as its companion. He believed the true scientist was a deeply spiritual person, not because of belief in supernatural beings, but because of reverence for what is. He wrote often about the sacred structure of the world, the mystery that no formula could fully explain. And this reverence made him kind. It made him patient. It made him aware of how little we truly understand and how dangerous it is to pretend otherwise. This awareness didn't make him passive. It made him responsible. He saw that with knowledge comes obligation, that intelligence without heart can be catastrophic. And so he urged younger scientists to become not only brilliant, but good. He spoke to students as if he were speaking to caretakers of the future. He told them that the measure of education wasn't how much one knew, but how well one used what they knew to alleviate suffering. At his desk, he kept letters from children who asked questions not about physics, but about peace, and he responded to them patiently, carefully, as if he knew that one kind word could shape a life. He answered not as a physicist, but as a grandfather of the human race, not from the Tower of Brilliance, but from the ground of shared humanity. In these final years, he also took to writing reflections not about black holes or relativity, but about compassion, forgiveness, and inner freedom. He seemed to understand intuitively what the sages have always known, that the greatest revolutions don't happen in governments or laboratories, but in the heart. That the most powerful discoveries are not external, but internal. That awakening is not a prize for the pious or the brilliant, it's a birthright. One available to anyone who dares to be present with life as it is. He was asked once what he believed the purpose of life was, and his answer was disarmingly simple: to serve others and to be useful. This from a man who had unveiled the secrets of space-time. To him, usefulness didn't mean ambition. It meant kindness. It meant listening. It meant doing what you could to ease the path of another. And here again, the Buddha's voice echoes through his words. For the Buddha, the path to liberation was through compassion, through seeing the suffering of others as your own, and acting with wisdom to ease it. Not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because once you see clearly, you cannot help but care. Einstein's clarity grew not with more information, but with more silence. He once said, "I live in that solitude which is painful in youth, but delicious in the years of maturity." He had grown to love being alone, not to escape, but to listen. He saw that silence wasn't the absence of noise. It was the presence of depth. And in that silence, he heard the same truths the Buddha had heard beneath the Bodhi tree: that everything changes, that everything is connected, and that peace begins within. He no longer feared death. In fact, he spoke of it with an almost serene acceptance, not because he had found religion in the traditional sense, but because he had found rhythm, the rhythm of the cosmos, the rhythm of impermanence. He saw life and death not as opposites, but as two steps in the same dance. He knew that the atoms of his body would return to the earth, that his thoughts would fade, but that the energy he embodied, the care, the insight, the love, would ripple outward, unmeasurable, yet real. When he passed, there was no grand ceremony, no parade, just quiet headlines, tributes from scholars, and tears from those who had felt his presence. But more than that, there was continuation. In every classroom where curiosity is nurtured, in every quiet moment of reflection, in every act of compassion born from understanding. He lived on, not in name, but in pattern. His story teaches us that the intellect is not the enemy of the soul, that science, when guided by wisdom, becomes sacred, that the more deeply you understand the workings of the universe, the more softly you must walk through it. That humility isn't a rejection of brilliance, it's its highest form. And perhaps more than anything, his life reminds us that we don't have to choose between reason and reverence, between knowledge and compassion, between logic and love. We can hold them both. We must hold them both. Because only together can they heal the fractured world we've inherited. He was, in the end, a bridge between disciplines, between cultures, between what is measurable and what is meaningful, between the known and the unknowable. He spent his life looking outward into the vastness of space and time, and returned to tell us that the greatest miracle might just be right here, in this breath, in this heart, in this moment. Somewhere in the quiet spaces between stars and silence, between scientific discovery and spiritual wonder, there lives a truth that doesn't need to be proven, only experienced. This is where Albert Einstein ultimately arrived, not in the halls of academia or on stages of prestige, but in the sacred stillness of knowing without needing to name. It is here, at the edge of what language can hold, that his legacy begins to transcend biography and becomes something more timeless, a living invitation to every one of us. Because the truth is, you don't need to be a physicist to feel what he felt. You don't need to solve equations or write theories to walk the same path. You simply need to ask the questions that matter. Not just, what is the universe made of? But how should we live inside it? Not how far can we go? But what do we become when we arrive? These are questions of the heart, of awareness, of presence, and they are as scientific as they are spiritual. Einstein's journey was never about escaping the world. It was about entering it more fully, with clearer eyes, with a softer voice, with a deeper sense of responsibility. He once said, "Our task must be to free ourselves by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." That's not physics. That's awakening. That's the same call the Buddha made when he spoke of right action, right intention, right mindfulness. Not as commandments, but as compass points guiding us toward harmony. In every breath, Einstein came to see not just biological necessity, but cosmic rhythm. In every interaction, not just social exchange, but a moment where empathy could enter. He began to live in a way that honored the unknown, that didn't fear mystery but bowed before it. He stopped trying to conquer reality and started listening to it, as though the universe was a quiet teacher, always whispering its lessons through stars and sorrow alike. And what it whispered most of all was this: there is no separation, no line between you and the world, between the observer and the observed, between the self and the other. That's not just quantum theory. That's the core of every wisdom tradition. The understanding that everything we do, everything we think, everything we feel, it echoes, it extends beyond us. It shapes what comes next. This is not abstract philosophy. This is the very real choice each of us makes every day. Do we see ourselves as separate or as part of the whole? Do we act from fear or from love? Do we pursue knowledge for power or for peace? Einstein's later writings were filled with these questions. He worried about the direction the world was heading, not just in terms of politics or war, but in terms of consciousness. He saw a species that was gaining tools faster than it was gaining wisdom, that could destroy itself faster than it could understand itself. And so he urged a return, not to the past, but to presence, to groundedness, to humility. And in this urging, his voice joined a timeless chorus, the voice of the Buddha, who warned that craving leads to suffering, the voice of mystics who taught that the heart must guide the mind, the voice of every parent who ever knelt to comfort a child and reminded them that love is stronger than fear. Einstein became that kind of voice, not loud, not domineering, but deeply grounded in experience. He didn't claim to have all the answers, but he offered something even more valuable, a way of seeing, a way of approaching life not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a relationship to be tended. To see the world through his eyes is to walk slower, to listen more, to ask better questions, to wonder not just at black holes and nebulae, but at the hands that prepare food, the rain tapping on windows, the silent language of trees. He knew that awe wasn't reserved for telescopes or microscopes. Awe lives in the ordinary, in the unrepeatable now, in the act of being fully here. And this is what makes his legacy so essential, not just for scientists or philosophers, but for everyone who is alive right now. In a world that moves too fast, that forgets too quickly, that seeks answers more than understanding, his life is a reminder to pause, to breathe, to remember that clarity does not require speed, that depth requires stillness. He reminds us that we can be brilliant and kind, that we can pursue truth and embody love, that we can use our minds without forgetting our hearts. These are not contradictions, they are integrations, and they are the blueprint for a better world.